The first thing most people noticed about Elena Ramirez was how quiet she had become. 3 years earlier, she had been the woman who argued with officers, laughed too loudly in the dining hall, and refused to let anyone decide what she should feel. Inside the Texas Correctional Facility, that defiance had slowly disappeared. At 29, Elena was serving a lengthy sentence, and the years had taught her that survival sometimes meant becoming invisible. Her days followed the same narrow rhythm. Wake before sunrise. Count. Breakfast. Work detail. Count again. She wrote letters twice a month and made short phone calls when she could afford them. Most were to people who had learned, over time, how difficult it was to hear her voice through a prison telephone. That morning began like every other. A routine inspection had been announced, sending officers through the housing units while inmates stood beside their bunks. Elena kept her eyes lowered as footsteps moved along the concrete corridor. Then Caleb Mercer appeared. He was not the loudest officer or the harshest. That was precisely why inmates trusted him more than most. Caleb spoke quietly, followed procedures, and rarely lost his temper. He had worked at the facility long enough to know every locked door, every blind corner, and every rule that kept the place functioning. When he reached Elena's cell, something changed. She looked up. For a moment, neither spoke. Caleb's expression remained controlled, but Elena's face tightened. Her fingers closed around the edge of her mattress, as though she needed something solid to hold. "Everything all right, Ramirez?" Caleb asked. "Yes, officer." Her answer came too quickly. He glanced toward her bunk. "Step away from it." Elena obeyed. Caleb checked the small space beneath the mattress, then moved on. But before he left, he looked back at her. Their eyes met again. It lasted only a second, yet it was enough for another inmate across the corridor to notice. Elena waited until Caleb disappeared around the corner before releasing the breath she had been holding. She told herself she was afraid because prison made everyone afraid. But that explanation no longer fit. For weeks, Elena had been hiding something from everyone around her. At first, she had blamed exhaustion on stress. Then came the nausea, the dizziness, and the strange tenderness in her body. She counted the days on her calendar until the numbers stopped making sense. That afternoon, during a medical appointment, the truth became impossible to ignore. The pregnancy test showed 2 lines. Elena stared at them for several seconds. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply folded the test into a piece of cloth, returned to her cell, and waited until the corridor became quiet. Then she lifted the mattress. Her hands trembled as she pushed the test into the narrow darkness beneath it. For the first time in years, Elena felt something more frightening than prison. She was pregnant. And somewhere beyond the concrete walls, someone else already knew enough to be afraid. Elena sat on the edge of the bunk, staring at the locked door. The question forming in her mind was almost impossible to say aloud. How had this happened inside a maximum security prison? And why did Caleb Mercer seem to know the answer already? The question followed Elena into the morning. By breakfast, the pregnancy was no longer entirely her secret. A medical report had reached the administration, and within hours, whispers traveled through the housing unit faster than any official announcement could. Nobody knew the father's name, but everyone knew the same impossible fact. Elena Ramirez was pregnant. Prison officials responded with practiced efficiency. Interviews were scheduled. Medical records were reviewed. Movement logs were requested. An internal investigator quietly began reconstructing Elena's recent movements, paying particular attention to the days she had left the facility for medical appointments. Perhaps Elena had encountered someone during a medical transfer. When Elena was questioned, she was asked directly who the father was. She stared at the table. "I don't want to say." The investigator leaned forward. "Ms. Ramirez, this isn't optional." Elena's jaw tightened. I said I don't want to say. She would not give them Caleb's name. She knew naming him could change everything. Across the facility, Caleb Mercer was discovering how quickly respect could turn into suspicion. Rumors reached him before the investigation did. Inmates watched him differently. Officers became quieter when he entered the staff room. Someone joked that the father must be a guard, and nobody laughed for long. Caleb tried to behave normally, but investigators had already noticed something. Over the previous months, Caleb had repeatedly requested assignments near Elena's housing unit. On paper, each request had an ordinary explanation: staffing shortages, shift coverage, familiarity with the unit. Together, however, the requests formed a pattern. And patterns were dangerous. That evening, Caleb sat alone in his car after his shift, staring through the windshield at the prison's floodlights. He thought about the first time Elena had spoken to him. Months earlier, she had been standing alone near the recreation yard after receiving a letter that had clearly devastated her. Caleb had noticed the tears she tried to hide. "You okay?" he had asked. She had shrugged. "Just having a bad day." He could have walked away. Instead, he stayed. He listened. That small decision became the beginning of everything. Over the following weeks, Caleb offered little kindnesses that seemed harmless at first. He remembered which books Elena liked. He asked whether her mother had written. He sometimes paused longer than necessary when speaking with her. To Elena, those moments felt important. After years of being treated as a number, Caleb made her feel visible. The boundary between compassion and intimacy disappeared quietly. A conversation became a private joke. A private joke became trust. Trust became emotional dependence. Elena began waiting for his shifts. Caleb began looking for her. Neither admitted what was happening. Eventually, they no longer needed words to acknowledge it. Elena convinced herself that Caleb loved her because he had listened when nobody else did. She imagined a future beyond the prison walls, one where her sentence ended, and they could build something ordinary together. Caleb imagined something different. He imagined losing his badge, his wife discovering everything, his coworkers finding out, his entire life collapsing because of one relationship he had allowed to become impossible to control. And now Elena was carrying a child. For the first time, Caleb understood that their secret was no longer something they could simply bury. Someone would eventually ask the question neither of them was prepared to answer. And Elena was beginning to believe that Caleb's fear had nothing to do with protecting her. Elena was beginning to understand that Caleb's fear was not the same thing as her fear. She wanted him to choose her. He wanted time. Whenever she imagined the future, she pictured a small house somewhere far from Texas, sunlight through open windows, and Caleb standing beside her without a uniform separating them. He had created that picture himself. During one of their private conversations, he had held her gaze and promised that he would never abandon her. "Once you're out," he had whispered, "we'll leave all of this behind." Where would we go? Anywhere. Somewhere nobody knows us. Elena had believed him. Those words became precious after she learned she was pregnant. They were the only future she could see through the walls around her. But the pregnancy also changed the balance between them. Caleb controlled things Elena could not. He knew which officers were working. He understood movement schedules. He knew when medical appointments were likely to occur, and which areas were monitored more closely. Elena understood only the limits imposed on her. That difference began to frighten her. She had spent years living under rules she could not challenge, and now the person she trusted most was using those same rules to keep her powerless. When she asked him for help, he sometimes answered immediately. Other times, he told her to wait. When she wanted information, he reminded her that asking too many questions could attract attention. "You said we'd face this together, Elena told him one evening. "We will. Then tell them the truth." Caleb looked toward the corridor before answering. "Not yet. I'm carrying your child." His expression tightened. "I know. Then why are you acting like this has nothing to do with you?" He lowered his voice. "Because if this comes out, everything changes." Everything already changed. Caleb had no answer. The next day, Elena met Tasha Williams in the recreation area. Tasha was serving her own sentence and had developed the cautious instincts that prison demanded. She had watched Elena change during the previous months. She had noticed the way Caleb looked toward her cell. She had noticed how often he appeared near Elena's housing unit. Now she finally spoke. "You need to be careful." Elena frowned. "About what?" "About him." Elena immediately knew whom Tasha meant. "Caleb isn't what you think." Tasha gave a humorless smile. "That's what everybody says before they get hurt." Elena looked away. Tasha continued quietly. "Guards don't risk their jobs for inmates unless they think they're protecting themselves too. He loves me." "You believe that?" "Yes." Tasha studied her face and saw something she had seen before, hope strong enough to survive facts. "Then ask yourself why he wants everything hidden." The question stayed with Elena long after Tasha walked away. She could feel it now. That night, Elena confronted Caleb again. "I can't keep lying." "You have to." "Why?" "Because we need to protect ourselves." "No. You need to protect yourself." Caleb's silence answered her. He finally stepped closer and spoke so softly that Elena almost missed the words. "If investigators ask, you don't know who the father is." Elena stared at him. "What? Say you don't know? You want me to lie?" "For now." Her heart sank. After everything he had promised, after every secret conversation and every impossible dream, Caleb was asking her to erase him from the story. Elena returned to her cell alone. For the first time, she wondered whether the man who promised to build a future with her was preparing to disappear before anyone could discover the truth. And by morning, someone inside the prison would begin asking why Caleb Mercer had been so determined to keep that truth hidden. The question about Caleb Mercer did not disappear by morning. It spread through the facility, reaching the administration offices before breakfast and forcing officials to confront something they had hoped to contain quietly. An inmate becoming pregnant was disturbing enough. The possibility that a correctional officer was involved threatened to expose failures in supervision, security, and judgment. By noon, the internal inquiry had stalled. Too many answers contradicted one another. That was when Detective Mara Bennett arrived. She was a senior investigator with a reputation for listening longer than people expected. She entered the facility without announcing any theory, carrying a thin folder and a notebook. Her first concern was simple: determine how Elena had become pregnant. Who had access to her? Mara asked. The administrator mentioned medical personnel, transport staff, and correctional officers. Every answer produced another question. When Mara interviewed Caleb, he appeared calm. "I barely interacted with Ramirez," he said. "She was one of many inmates in my assigned area." Mara wrote something down. "How many times did you request that assignment?" Caleb hesitated. "I don't remember." "I do." She placed several scheduling records on the table. Caleb looked at them without touching them. The records showed repeated requests placing him near Elena's housing unit. His explanation was staff inconvenience, but Mara noticed the dates. Several requests had been made when no staffing shortage existed. The surveillance records created an even larger problem. Caleb's movements appeared near Elena's unit far more often than his statement suggested. When Mara questioned a nurse, the woman initially avoided eye contact. Did Elena seem emotionally attached to anyone? The nurse sighed. Yes. Who? An officer. Which officer? After a long silence, she said, Caleb Mercer. Another employee remembered seeing Caleb outside Elena's housing area during hours, when he had no obvious reason to be there. Each statement added another piece to the same troubling picture. Yet when Mara finally spoke with Elena, the story changed. Elena sat rigidly across from her, hands folded tightly in her lap. Did Officer Mercer father your child? Elena stared at the table. Yes. Was the relationship consensual? A long pause followed. Yes. Mara studied her face. Did he ever threaten you? No. Did he ever pressure you to hide the relationship? Elena's eyes flickered toward the door. No. The answer sounded rehearsed. Mara closed her notebook. Elena, you understand that telling me something untrue could make this harder. I know. Then why are you protecting him? Elena looked up. I'm not protecting anyone. But Mara had spent enough years investigating people to recognize fear when she saw it. The question was whose fear she was seeing. Before leaving, Mara requested every available record concerning Elena's movements, including medical appointments, visitor logs, staff schedules, and security footage. She also asked for records showing which officers had access to Elena's housing area. The administrator looked uncomfortable. Is that necessary? Mara met his eyes. Someone became pregnant inside a secured facility. Yes, it is necessary. The request changed the atmosphere immediately. People who had treated the matter as an embarrassing incident now understood that an outside investigator was looking beneath the surface. Later, Elena returned to the housing unit and found Tasha waiting quietly. You talked to them, Tasha said. Elena nodded. What did you tell them? The truth. Tasha studied her expression. No. You told them what you were supposed to tell them. Elena looked away. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Elena finally whispered the words she had been carrying since her interview. He said if I told the truth, both of us would lose everything. Tasha's face changed. And somewhere inside the administration building, Detective Bennett was reading the same words in her notes, realizing that Elena's silence might be more dangerous than any confession. Neither woman noticed the silent officer standing at the far end of the corridor, listening carefully before quietly walking away. Several weeks passed, but for Elena, time no longer moved normally. She waited for his messages with a desperation that frightened her. When her phone remained silent, hope turned quickly into panic. Her emotions became impossible to control. 1 hour, she convinced herself Caleb was simply being careful. He was trapped inside, surrounded by rules and people he could not trust. Surely he needed time. Surely the promises he had made were still real. The next hour, darker thoughts overwhelmed her. Maybe he had already decided to disappear. Maybe everything he had told her had only been useful while he needed her. She replayed old conversations in her head, searching for clues hidden inside ordinary words. Caleb's behavior only made things worse. His calls became shorter. Then they became less frequent. Messages that had once arrived throughout the day were reduced to brief replies, sometimes hours or even days apart. When Elena asked about their future, Caleb stopped speaking with confidence. He no longer described where they would live, what they would do, or how they would raise their child. He simply said he needed time. But after several more weeks, patience became impossible. She needed an answer, and she needed it directly from him. During their next controlled prison interaction, Elena entered the room already trembling with anger. The meeting was conducted under strict rules, with every movement watched and every conversation subject to supervision. Caleb sat across from her, appearing strangely calm. Elena did not waste time. Are you going to acknowledge this child? Caleb looked at her for several seconds before answering. You know I need time. I've given you time, Elena said. You keep saying the same thing. He lowered his eyes. There are things you don't understand. Then explain them. Caleb remained silent. Elena felt something inside her finally break. For weeks, she had protected Caleb in her own mind. She had explained his behavior, defended his distance, and believed that fear was the reason he could not make a clear decision. Now she wondered whether she had simply been protecting someone who never intended to protect her. You promised me, she said. You promised me that you would stand by me. I said I would try. No. You said you would be there. Caleb leaned closer, lowering his voice. Elena, you need to be careful. Her anger immediately turned cold. Careful of what? He looked toward the observing officers, then back at her. You don't understand what happens to people who expose men like me. The words stayed with her. They were not shouted. They were not delivered as an obvious threat. That made them more frightening. Caleb had spoken quietly, almost as though he were giving her advice. But Elena understood what he meant. You think I'm afraid of you? She asked. I think you should think about what you're doing. Elena stood when the interaction ended. She walked away carrying this sentence with her. That evening, she found the hidden notebook she had started keeping weeks earlier. She sat alone and opened to a blank page. Her hand shook as she wrote Caleb's name. Then she began documenting everything. She described how their relationship had started, what Caleb had told her, what he had promised, and how his behavior had changed. She wrote about the prison meetings. She recorded his warning exactly as she remembered it. Most importantly, she wrote one sentence twice. She no longer trusted him. The pages filled quickly. By the time she closed the notebook, Elena understood that she had created something that could change everything. It was no longer simply a private diary. It was a record of events, names, promises, and fear. She hid the notebook carefully, believing that secrecy would keep it safe. But Elena did not know that someone else had already become interested in what she knew. The next morning, the notebook was gone. She checked drawers, bags, shelves, and every place she could remember leaving it. Nothing. She stared at the empty space where the notebook had been and felt a certainty settle over her. Someone had found it. Someone had read her words. And someone now knew exactly what she had decided to do next. The pages containing Caleb's name had vanished without a trace. And with them disappeared the first written account of the relationship that investigators would later struggle to reconstruct. But Elena's missing notebook was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the investigation that would finally force Detective Bennett to look beyond Caleb's carefully protected version of events. The disappearance of Elena's notebook should have been the first warning. Instead, the missing pages became only one piece of a much larger mystery. The following morning, Elena was expected at a medical appointment. Her attendance had been arranged in advance, and the facility had procedures for moving her through controlled areas. When she failed to appear, the prison employee responsible for the appointment initially assumed there had been a scheduling mistake. He checked the records. The appointment was real. He checked again. Elena was supposed to be there. A few minutes later, another inmate reported seeing Elena earlier that morning. According to the inmate, Elena had been escorted through a restricted corridor by someone wearing facility identification. That detail immediately changed everything. The employee contacted his supervisor. Then the alarm was raised. Within minutes, the facility entered lockdown. Doors were secured. Movement was restricted. Officers began searching corridors, rooms, offices, storage areas, and every location Elena could possibly have reached. Her absence was no longer an administrative problem. She was missing. When Detective Bennett arrived, he understood immediately that the case had changed. Until that moment, the investigation had centered on Elena's pregnancy, her relationship with Caleb, and the increasingly troubling questions surrounding Caleb's promises. Now those questions had become part of something more urgent. This was a missing person case. Bennett demanded every available record. Start from the last confirmed sighting, he ordered. Officers reconstructed Elena's movements. She had been expected at the medical appointment. She had not arrived. Someone claimed to have seen her being escorted through a restricted corridor. After that, there was no reliable confirmation of where she went. Then Bennett asked the question everyone had been avoiding. Where is Caleb? Caleb was brought in for questioning. He appeared composed. Too composed. When Bennett told him Elena was missing, Caleb's expression barely changed. He immediately denied knowing anything about her disappearance. I didn't do anything, he said. Bennett watched him carefully. You knew she was going to a medical appointment? Yes. You spoke with her recently? Yes. You threatened her? Caleb's expression hardened. No. Bennett repeated the question in a different way, but Caleb gave essentially the same answers. He claimed Elena had been emotional, that she had been under pressure, and that he had no reason to know where she might have gone. The explanation sounded polished. Rehearsed. Bennett had spent enough time interviewing suspects to recognize the difference between someone remembering events and someone repeating a story they had prepared beforehand. He ordered investigators to review the facility's surveillance system. At first, the cameras appeared to show nothing unusual. Then an officer stopped the footage. There was a gap. Several minutes of surveillance were missing from the exact period when Elena disappeared. Bennett leaned toward the monitor. Go back. The officer replayed the sequence. Again, the same gap appeared. Someone had accessed the surveillance system. The missing footage was not a random technical failure. The system log showed activity during the critical period. Whoever had accessed it had known what they were looking for and, more importantly, had known how to remove the evidence. Bennett felt the investigation becoming darker. This was no longer simply a disappearance involving a prisoner and a vulnerable woman. Someone inside the facility had knowledge of the system. Someone understood the security procedures. Someone had enough access to manipulate the evidence. The search expanded. Bennett ordered the area sealed immediately. No one was permitted to touch anything until photographs and forensic records were completed. He noticed that the belongings had been arranged strangely, not scattered by accident. The bag was open, but nothing valuable appeared missing. It looked as though someone wanted investigators to find the items there. That realization made the silence around the maintenance corridor feel deliberate, almost staged, as if the person responsible expected them to arrive and understand why. Officers moved through maintenance rooms and service passages that were rarely used by ordinary staff. Eventually, one officer noticed a door leading to a secluded maintenance area. Inside, scattered across the floor, were Elena's personal belongings. Her bag, several small personal items, and something else. A photograph. Bennett picked it up carefully. It showed Elena and Caleb together, posed like a married couple. The image looked almost like a wedding photograph, except there had never been a wedding. It had been created privately by Elena, as a fantasy of the future she once believed they might have. Now the photograph had been torn cleanly in half. Bennett stared at the two pieces. One half showed Elena. The other showed Caleb. The meaning was impossible to ignore. Someone had not merely taken Elena. Someone had deliberately left behind a message. And somewhere beyond those locked doors, the truth about Elena's disappearance was still waiting to be found. The torn photograph remained on Detective Bennett's desk long after the maintenance area had been cleared. It was the last thing anyone had found that belonged to Elena, and somehow it made the silence around her disappearance feel even heavier. Then, after an extensive search beyond the prison perimeter, officers found what they had been hoping they would never find. Elena's body was discovered in an isolated area, far from the main buildings and hidden from ordinary view. The location immediately raised questions. She could not have reached such a place easily without assistance, and nothing about the scene suggested an accidental death. Bennett arrived before the area was released to investigators. He stood behind the evidence markers and looked toward the body in silence. Until that moment, there had still been a possibility that Elena might somehow be found alive. Now that possibility was gone. The case changed instantly. This was no longer a missing person investigation. It was homicide. News of Elena's death devastated Tasha. Of all the people connected to Elena, Tasha had been one of the few she genuinely trusted. She remembered the fear in Elena's voice during their conversations, and the way Elena had begun watching doors, checking messages, and questioning people around her. Now those memories felt different. Bennett noticed the same pattern. Elena had been frightened before she disappeared. The scene itself offered little comfort. There were no witnesses willing to speak, no simple explanation for how Elena had reached the isolated location, and no immediate weapon that could settle the question. Investigators photographed the ground, collected fibers, documented footprints, and searched nearby structures for anything that might explain what had happened. Tasha struggled to accept the news. She kept remembering the notebook, the warnings Elena had described, and the photograph that had been torn apart. She wondered whether Elena had sensed what was coming, and tried to leave behind clues before it was too late. Bennett listened carefully when Tasha spoke. "Did Elena ever tell you she was being followed?" Tasha hesitated. "Not exactly," she answered. "But she said she felt watched." That sentence stayed with Bennett. He wrote it in his notebook and underlined it twice. Because if Elena had truly believed someone was watching her, then the surveillance footage was no longer an isolated problem. It might have been evidence of something much bigger. And Bennett suspected the missing notebook might contain the answer they needed if it had not already been destroyed. The medical examiner soon confirmed what the scene had already suggested. Her death was not accidental. Someone had caused it. The question was who? Caleb quickly became the obvious suspect. His motive was difficult to ignore. If Elena exposed their relationship, Caleb could lose nearly everything he had spent years protecting. His job could disappear. His marriage could collapse. His reputation could be destroyed. His freedom could be at risk. For investigators, that was enough to put him at the center of the inquiry. But Bennett refused to make the mistake of confusing motive with proof. The evidence began arriving anyway. Investigators discovered Caleb's fingerprints on property connected to Elena. His access records placed him near restricted areas during important periods. His phone records revealed communications that had been deleted, including activity around the time Elena disappeared. Each discovery seemed to point in the same direction. Caleb. Yet Bennett felt increasingly uncomfortable. The evidence was almost too convenient. Every answer seemed to arrive exactly where investigators expected to find it. The missing surveillance footage pointed inward. Caleb's movements placed him near restricted locations. His deleted communications created suspicion. His motive was obvious. But obvious was not the same as true. Bennett returned to the surveillance records and examined them again. He studied access logs, staff movements, and the timing of every known event. Then he found something that changed the entire shape of the investigation. Caleb had not been the only person who knew about Elena's pregnancy. Someone else had known. Not only that, but someone had been watching Elena for weeks. The monitoring appeared deliberate. Her movements had been tracked. Her conversations had been observed. Someone had been interested in where she went, whom she contacted, and what she knew. Bennett stared at the records, realizing the case had been built around the wrong question. Everyone had been asking whether Caleb wanted Elena silenced. Now Bennett needed to know who had been watching them both. He ordered the team to trace every person who had access to Elena's movements, medical information, prison records, and communications. For the first time, Caleb's guilt no longer seemed like the final answer. It looked like part of a larger plan. And somewhere inside the facility's records was the name of the person who had been watching Elena long before she vanished. The name hidden inside the surveillance records led Detective Bennett deeper into the prison administration, where the investigation began uncovering something far more disturbing than one secret relationship. Bennett requested every complaint involving inappropriate contact between officers and inmates. At first, administrators resisted, insisting that most incidents had been handled internally. But the records told a different story. Complaints had been filed before Elena ever became involved with Caleb. Officers had been accused of crossing boundaries, exchanging private messages, giving inmates special treatment, and developing relationships that should never have existed. Again and again, those complaints had been reduced to minor disciplinary matters. Warnings were issued. Reports were closed. Transfers were arranged. And then everyone moved on. Bennett studied the pattern carefully. It was not one mistake. It was repeated behavior. The institution had learned how to protect itself. That realization changed the investigation. If administrators had known vulnerable inmates were being approached by officers and had chosen to minimize the problem, then Elena's story could not be viewed as an isolated tragedy. Her relationship with Caleb might have been encouraged by a system that failed to recognize how much power he held over her. Then a former employee agreed to speak. The employee asked Bennett for privacy and admitted knowing about Elena's earlier attempt to report Caleb. According to the former employee, Elena had approached the proper channel and tried to describe Caleb's behavior. She had been frightened, confused, and uncertain about what would happen if she continued. Then, before the complaint could move forward, Elena withdrew it. "Why?" Bennett asked. The former employee looked down. She was pressured. By Caleb? Not only him. That answer stopped Bennett. The employee explained that Elena had been warned about the consequences of making accusations against an officer. She could lose privileges. She could create problems for herself. People suggested that she might be misunderstood, that the situation could become worse if she continued. Eventually, Elena backed down. Bennett closed his notebook slowly. The case was no longer simply about a forbidden relationship. It was becoming an investigation into a culture where protecting the institution mattered more than protecting vulnerable people. But Bennett still needed evidence connecting that culture to Elena's death. Then investigators discovered something unexpected. Caleb had secretly recorded several conversations with Elena. At first, the discovery appeared to strengthen the case against him. Why would he record their private conversations unless he had been preparing to protect himself? Bennett listened to the recordings one by one. Some contained ordinary arguments. Others revealed Caleb attempting to convince Elena that she needed to remain quiet. His words confirmed that he understood the danger surrounding their relationship and feared exposure. Then Bennett reached the final recording. Elena's voice sounded different. She was breathing quickly. "Someone is following me." There was a pause. Caleb answered, "What do you mean?" "I mean someone is watching me. I see the same person everywhere." Caleb's voice changed immediately. "Who?" "I don't know." "Are you sure?" "Yes." Another silence followed. Then Elena said something that made Bennett stop the recording. "Caleb, I think they know about the baby." Bennett replayed the exchange. Caleb sounded genuinely shocked. There was no hesitation, no carefully prepared response, and no sign that he already understood what Elena was describing. For the first time, Bennett considered a possibility he had previously rejected. Caleb could have been guilty of exploiting Elena. He could have manipulated her, lied to her, and protected himself at her expense. And yet, he could still be innocent of her murder. The distinction mattered. Bennett returned to the evidence room and looked again at the torn photograph, the missing surveillance footage, the deleted communications, and the record showing Elena had been monitored. Someone had been watching her. Someone had known about the pregnancy. Someone had access to information that should have remained private. And someone had wanted the evidence to point toward Caleb. The question was no longer simply whether Caleb had killed Elena. Bennett wrote a new question across the top of the case file. Who needed Elena dead? For the first time since the investigation began, Bennett believed that answering that question might reveal the person who had been hiding behind Caleb's shadow all along. But before he could identify that person, he would have to discover exactly how Elena had become a threat to someone she might never even have known existed. Bennett felt the case shift beneath him once again. Whoever that person was, the repeated appearances suggested planning, not coincidence. He ordered the visitor's background checked immediately. Until the results arrived, the team had only one certainty. Elena had not imagined the danger. Someone had been watching her, and that watcher had been close enough to enter the prison without attracting suspicion for months. The room stayed silent after Tasha finished speaking. For several seconds, Bennett could hear nothing except the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above them. Tasha kept her eyes lowered, her hands locked together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "She gave it to me 3 days before she disappeared," Tasha finally said. "She told me not to open it unless something happened to her." Bennett leaned forward. "And something happened." Tasha nodded. She reached beneath the mattress and pulled out a small envelope wrapped in plastic. Elena's name was written across the front in uneven handwriting. There was no address, no date, only one word beneath her name. "Please." Tasha hesitated before handing it over. "I was scared," she whispered. "People here talk. Guards talk. Officials talk. I thought if I gave this to the wrong person, they would make my life worse." Bennett understood. Fear had protected the truth almost as effectively as any locked door. He opened the envelope carefully. Elena's letter began with an apology. She wrote that she had spent months convincing herself she could survive Caleb's promises. He had told her he loved her. He had promised to protect her after learning she was pregnant. He had said they would leave everything behind and start somewhere new. Then, little by little, those promises changed. Caleb began deciding who she could speak to. He questioned where she went and who she trusted. When Elena talked about the pregnancy, he became distant. When she threatened to tell someone what he had done, he reminded her that nobody would believe a frightened woman with a complicated past. She wrote that she had become afraid of him. But Caleb was not the only name in the letter. Near the final pages, Elena described someone else. A prison employee. She said the woman had appeared repeatedly near places where Elena had been questioned. She had dismissed Elena's complaints, told her she was imagining things, and once warned her that making accusations could create problems she could not control. Bennett stopped reading. He knew the name. Mara Voss. Voss had worked inside the prison administration for years. During Elena's disappearance investigation, she had been interviewed once and had described Elena as anxious, unstable, and prone to exaggeration. Bennett immediately requested her personnel records. Within an hour, another problem surfaced. The missing surveillance footage had not simply vanished. Someone had altered the archive. The forensic team recovered fragments showing that the deletion occurred after Elena disappeared. More importantly, the access credentials belonged to an administrative account with privileges far above those available to ordinary staff. Bennett stared at the report. Caleb had lied about his movements. He had lied about Elena. His story was already breaking apart. But now the evidence suggested something larger. Someone inside the prison system had helped erase part of the truth. Someone with access. Someone who knew exactly where the cameras had been pointed. Bennett returned to the administrative wing before midnight. He searched old cabinets, transfer records, disciplinary files, and archive correspondence. Dust covered most of the shelves. The building felt abandoned, yet every locked drawer seemed to contain another piece of Elena's disappearance. Then he noticed a cabinet that was marked for disposal. Inside, behind outdated personnel forms, was a thin black notebook. Elena's notebook. Bennett opened it with trembling fingers. Most of the pages contained ordinary notes, names, dates, appointments, fragments of conversations. Then he reached the final page. Only one sentence had been written there. "If something happens to me, don't believe the first person who confesses." Bennett read it twice. Then he looked back at Caleb's confession. For the first time, he wondered whether Elena had known exactly how this investigation would unfold. He turned another page, but there was nothing beneath the sentence, no explanation and no second name. Yet the warning felt deliberate. Elena had not feared death. She had feared the story that would follow it. Bennett closed the notebook slowly, realizing that every answer they had trusted might have been constructed by someone who understood the investigation all along. And if she had, the next question was terrifying. Who had she expected to confess first? Bennett kept Elena's notebook on the table between himself and Caleb. Caleb stared at the final sentence, as though the words had been written for him alone. Then he looked up. "You found that?" "Yes." Caleb swallowed. "Then you know I lied." Bennett's voice remained controlled. "About what?" "About Elena. About us. About what I promised her." Caleb finally began to speak. He admitted that his relationship with Elena had never been what he claimed. He had told her that he loved her, but he had used those words whenever they benefited him. He promised to help her after learning she was pregnant, then used her fear of exposure to keep her dependent on him. He admitted that he had abused his position of authority. He had influenced decisions and made Elena believe that challenging him would destroy whatever protection she had left. When she demanded answers about their future, he gave her another promise. When she threatened to tell someone, he reminded her of everything she could lose. "You made her believe she had nowhere to go," Bennett said. Caleb looked down. "I know. And you lied to her about the baby. I was afraid. You were afraid of being exposed." Caleb closed his eyes. "Yes." He admitted that he had promised Elena a future he never intended to provide. He admitted that when she became pregnant, he had panicked. He admitted that when she began talking about reporting him, he became frightened enough to manipulate her even more. But when Bennett asked the question that mattered most, Caleb shook his head. "I did not kill her." Bennett watched him carefully. "You expect me to believe that?" "I expect you to believe what the evidence shows." Bennett returned to the evidence. The altered surveillance records showed that someone with higher administrative access had manipulated the archive. Elena's testimony in the notebook identified a prison employee who had repeatedly dismissed her fears. Tasha's statement established that Elena had been frightened of someone beyond Caleb. Then came the forensic evidence. Traces recovered from Elena's belongings connected her final movements to an administrative area controlled by Mara Voss. Voss's credentials had been used to access the surveillance system after Elena disappeared. Voss denied everything. Then investigators confronted her with the recovered footage. A fragment showed Voss entering the restricted records area shortly before the surveillance archive was altered. Her explanation collapsed. She had been watching Elena. Under questioning, Voss finally revealed the motive. Elena's pregnancy threatened to expose more than Caleb's misconduct. Voss had helped conceal a pattern of abuse, intimidation, and falsified records inside the facility. Elena had begun asking questions that could connect several incidents together. If Elena spoke, the entire structure could unravel. Caleb had created the vulnerability by manipulating Elena and leaving her frightened and isolated. Voss had exploited that vulnerability. She had convinced herself that eliminating Elena would protect the facility, her position, and everyone who had helped maintain the silence. Bennett listened as the confession unfolded, feeling no satisfaction. Caleb was responsible for devastating Elena's life. Voss was responsible for ending it. Both truths could exist at once. He looked exhausted. "I wanted everyone to think I was innocent," Caleb said. "But innocent of murder isn't the same as innocent." Bennett let the silence remain. For once, Caleb seemed to understand the difference. Bennett gathered the records and stood. The case had changed shape completely. Caleb's confession was no longer an ending. It was a doorway into something larger, and Elena's warning had pointed directly through it. Somewhere inside the facility, a person was still hiding behind the truth. Later, Bennett returned to Elena's notebook and read the final sentence again. "If something happens to me, don't believe the first person who confesses." Now he understood. Elena had known that the truth could be buried beneath someone else's guilt. Caleb had confessed because he was guilty of something. Voss had counted on that guilt to become the whole story. And as Bennett closed the notebook, he realized the case was no longer about discovering who had lied. It was about understanding why Elena had known, long before anyone else, that someone would try to make her disappearance look simpler than it really was. The case did not end when Mara Voss was arrested. For Bennett, that was the first difficult lesson of what happened to Elena. An arrest could identify a killer, but it could not repair everything that had allowed the crime to happen. The months that followed brought consequences far beyond the prison walls. Caleb was prosecuted for his misconduct and the crimes connected to his abuse of authority. His promises to Elena were examined in court, along with the lies, manipulation, and intimidation that had kept her trapped in a relationship she had once believed would become a future. He had not killed Elena. But the courtroom made one thing painfully clear. Innocence of murder did not erase responsibility for the damage he had caused. The prison itself became the subject of investigations. Officials examined missing records, altered surveillance files, ignored complaints, and relationships that had crossed professional boundaries. Lawsuits were filed by former inmates and employees. Administrators were suspended. Disciplinary hearings followed. Reporters gathered outside the gates, asking questions that should have been asked years earlier. For the first time, the facility could not hide behind locked doors. Tasha refused to disappear into the background. She testified. She spoke to investigators. She told anyone willing to listen that Elena had tried to warn people before she vanished. Tasha knew how easily fear could silence a person, because she had experienced that fear herself. "She was not imagining things," Tasha said during one public hearing. "She was asking for someone to listen." Those words stayed with Bennett. He had spent his career searching for evidence after crimes occurred. But Elena's case forced him to think about the evidence that came before a crime. The frightened conversation, the unanswered complaint, the strange behavior dismissed as paranoia, the warning that seemed too inconvenient to investigate. He wondered how different the ending might have been if someone had listened sooner. Maybe Elena would still be alive. Maybe the pregnancy would have been exposed before it became a threat. Maybe Caleb would have been stopped before his manipulation became abuse. Maybe Voss would never have believed that silence could protect her. There was no way to know. That uncertainty became the hardest part. Elena's pregnancy remained at the center of the tragedy. It represented more than a secret. It represented the collision of power, fear, emotional dependency, institutional failure, and the terrible consequences of allowing private relationships to become entangled with authority. A life that should have represented hope had instead become something people tried to conceal. Years later, Bennett visited the memorial created for Elena. It stood quietly beneath a row of trees, away from the prison and the cameras. Her name was carved into a simple stone surrounded by flowers, photographs, and handwritten messages from people who had never known her personally, but had come to understand what her story represented. Bennett stood alone for several minutes. Then he opened Elena's notebook. He read the final sentence one last time. "I wasn't afraid of the truth. I was afraid nobody would believe me." Bennett closed the notebook. The wind moved gently through the trees. Behind him, the prison remained in the distance, its walls unchanged despite everything that had happened within them. But Bennett knew walls were never the real danger. Silence was. The memorial remained quiet as he walked away, leaving Elena's name behind. The story of her death had finally been uncovered, but the question it left behind was larger than any single investigation. For Bennett, that question would remain long after the case files were closed. He knew investigations usually began with a body, a witness, or a piece of evidence. Elena's had begun much earlier, with a woman trying to tell people that something was wrong. Her voice had been there. Her fear had been there. Her warnings had been there. What failed was not the absence of information, but the willingness to recognize what that information meant. By the time everyone finally listened, there was nothing left to save except the truth. And sometimes, Bennett understood, truth arrives too late to prevent tragedy. How many warnings have to be ignored before a secret becomes a crime scene?